None of the locals understood why this horse was always surrounded by a pack of wolves but was never attacked by them. Only when one of the locals got up close and personal with this strange group of animals did he manage to figure out what was going on there. But the explanation was more disturbing than he could have ever imagined. At first, they thought that they needed to save the horse from the wolves. But maybe it was actually the other way around. It had taken Hunter Dillon about a day of searching until he finally found the horse surrounded by wolves. He had heard so much about it from the locals, and now he was finally close enough to the animal to shoot it down. It would make a great hunting trophy. Dillon hadn't pulled the trigger yet when he noticed that there was something weird going on with the horse. His curiosity got the better of him, and he quietly got closer to the scene until he had a good enough view. He needed to take a closer look at this. Suddenly, everything made perfect sense to him. Now it was clear why the wolves followed the horse so religiously, without hurting or killing it. Dillon realized that the rest of the world needed to know about this. But what did Dillon see exactly? Why were the wolves following the horse? And was Dillon still going to shoot down the animal? When locals first stumbled upon the abandoned horse, they wanted to capture it and bring it back to whatever stable it had escaped from. It was very dangerous for it to be wandering around in this cold Alaskan forest by itself. But they would soon find out that the horse was not alone at all. When the locals came closer to the horse, they discovered that it was surrounded by wolves. And as soon as these wolves noticed that there were people close and coming up the mountain, they approached them right away. They were growling and showing their teeth on full display. The locals thought that even though they wanted to save this horse, it was not worth risking their own lives for. They rushed back to the safety of their village as fast as they could, assuming that the wolves were going to feast on the poor horse. But surprisingly, nothing like that happened. To the locals' relief, the wolves did not chase them. Instead, they just calmly returned to the horse. But they didn't attack it. They surrounded the animal, almost like they were trying to protect it. But from what or who? Why would they do something like this? It had been a hard winter for the past couple of months, and it was safe to assume that these wolves had not had enough to eat. Reports were coming in from all over the state of wolves attacking people and other animals, probably out of pure desperation. They were just so hungry. One of the locals was still shocked and confused by the scene that he'd seen, although there was one theory he considered to be plausible. Perhaps the wolves had recently made a big kill, and they were still full from it? It would make sense to keep this horse alive and only consume the poor animal in more scarce times. Not long after, he saw how the horse slowly walked back into the woods and the wolves followed right behind it. How this horse stayed so calm all the time was still a big mystery to everyone. They had assumed that this was the last time they would see the poor creature, but they were very wrong. After the encounter, the locals looked at each other and discussed what to do. Was it morally just to interfere with this unique natural phenomenon and attempt to save the horse's life? They couldn't agree on it. However, they all thought that they should ask around and see if anybody was missing a black and white horse in the village. The owner deserved to know what happened to it. To their surprise, nobody in the village seemed to be missing a horse. However, in their quest of finding the horse's owner, the locals met a woman who seemed to know very well what horse they were talking about. It was unmistakable that she had seen the uniquely colored black and white horse before. The woman started telling them about something that had taken place a week earlier. She'd been walking along the edge of the woods at the top of a hill when she saw the same horse surrounded by a pack of wolves. She wasn't the only one who had spotted it, and this proved that this strange behavior among the animals had been going on for some time already. It appeared that many people from the village had been talking about this phenomenon for a while. They were pretty sure that the wolf pack had no intention of eating the horse. 3 of the locals were so intrigued by this that they decided to try and spot the pack again the next day. And indeed, they saw the same thing again when they showed up near the village. The three of them confirmed that the wolves indeed expressed no interest in eating the long-legged animal. They spotted the horse in a field with the wolves following it about 3 meters behind it. This sight truly baffled the trio, and this time they took it upon themselves to get proof. The trio decided to take pictures so they could share this story with the rest of the world. While they kept themselves at a safe distance from the horse and the wolves, they made some impressive photos of the animals. More people needed to see this extraordinary behavior. A couple of hours later, after the animals had disappeared again, the trio posted a selection of the photographs they had taken on social media. Within minutes, the images were already widely reposted, and people from all over the world became interested in the story. Among them was a man named Dylan. When Dylan, a young hunter, saw the pictures on social media, they immediately triggered him. He had to admit that at first he thought the images were photoshopped or something. But after seeing so many photos of the animals from different angles, he was convinced that it had to be real. And when he realized that this was a very unique phenomenon, he suddenly felt a deep desire to find out what had caused this extremely unlikely partnership. It even became an obsession that Dylan simply couldn't let go of. What was going on in those woods, in the middle of the Alaskan mountains? After a while, Dylan just couldn't take it anymore. He packed up his hunting equipment and set out to the village in a 4-hour-long drive. There was more to his intentions than he made it seem, but he decided not to share his true intentions with anybody else just yet. If anyone asked about it, he would say that he had always been interested in animal behavior, and he was eager to find out what was going on here. But, in reality, he wanted to shoot this beautiful horse and put it up as a trophy. Dylan had been collecting unique trophies all over America, and killing the king of wolves would make for a great story. Even though it was a 4-hour drive, he had often visited towns in this area, and he knew that culturally blending in with the locals would not be a problem. Nobody realized that he was from another county. On top of that, his car had a legitimate Alaskan license plate, so nobody even noticed him. As it turns out, it was a smart move to keep his true intentions hidden, as the locals were starting to view the horse in a mythical light. It was becoming a local legend that everybody had heard about through friends, family, or neighbors. Dylan noticed this straight away and concluded that he had to operate in secret. Dylan stayed in a motel a bit further away from the village. He planned on going into the woods first thing the next morning. He did not want to wait for the pack to visit the village again, as this would only put them more in the spotlight. He needed to get his job done before that could happen. He started his search as soon as the sun came out. He quickly went to the woods and made sure that nobody spotted him on the way there. When he finally arrived, everything was eerily quiet. The forest almost seemed to be abandoned. Dylan thought this was odd. Ever since he was a child, Dylan spent most of his free time in the woods. He could easily recognize it when something was off. Sure, it made perfect sense that there was less wildlife in the forest right now. It was simply too cold for some animals. But as he walked around, he noticed something odd. Everywhere Dylan looked, he just couldn't spot any living creature for miles and miles around him. And he was an experienced hunter, so he definitely knew how to spot an animal that was near. Was there something around that had scared everything away? Could this perhaps have something to do with the horse and wolf pack? When he looked at his watch, Dylan realized that he had already been in the forest for 3 hours without seeing any living animal. He continued his search, but he was getting close to giving up. But then he finally heard something that could only come from a living being right there in the forest. The sound he heard couldn't be anything else but the howling of a wolf. He stopped in his tracks and just stood there for a few minutes, listening to the sounds of nature. And luckily for him, the sounds told him everything he needed to know right now. As Dylan listened to the howls, he recognized some differences in the sounds. He realized that this could only mean that a whole pack of wolves was somewhere close to him. And he knew that this could only be the wolves that had included the horse into their pack, as wolves' territories often spread over huge pieces of land. The young hunter put everything back in his backpack except for his rifle. He stretched his weapon over his back, but close enough to be able to grab it swiftly. He slowly made his way over to where the sounds were coming from, while remaining as silent as he could. Judging by the howls, the wolves seemed to be moving. Dylan knew that he needed to hurry if he wanted to make this kill. It would be the kill of a lifetime, and he'd finally be able to brag to all of the others in the hunting community. Everyone would definitely look up to him, or even be jealous of his incredible catch. From the howls, he concluded that the wolves were moving right toward the village. That was the one thing he hoped wouldn't happen. If the horse got too close to civilization, people might see Dylan shoot it. And if that happened, it would all be over for him. Dylan realized that he needed to take a different approach in order to succeed. He thought about it, and he decided that speed was a priority right now. He started running through the woods, making his way to the howls as fast as he could. However, this did involve taking a big risk. Running, he made a lot more noise, and chances were that the pack would hear him. If that happened, the wolves might be scared away. However, it was a risk he needed to take if he wanted a chance of succeeding. Dylan decided to keep on running until he finally saw a glimpse of what he had been searching for. Luckily, this did not take long. Soon enough, Dylan spotted a large creature moving through the trees. He froze, not knowing whether the animal had already noticed him as well. From what he could see, the tall mammal definitely had black and white fur. Could this be the horse that everyone had been talking about? When Dylan moved just a little bit closer, he could finally see the whole picture. At least 4 wolves were circling the horse, which again seemed totally calm. He was amazed by the fact that the horse was not afraid of the wolves at all, and, what was maybe even crazier, the wolves showed no intention of hurting it. Dylan had seen enough. The animals were not traveling at this point, but rather just circling around in one area. He slowly got down on his knees and looked down through his rifle. Could he line up a shot? It was nearly impossible, as the horse was moving through the tree lines way too much. Dylan was very aware of the fact that he only had one chance. He knew that he had to act fast, but if he missed, there was no doubt that the sound would alert all the animals. Usually, this ought to scare away the wolf pack, but this group had been acting so strange that Dylan couldn't rule out that they would not run, but attack him instead. Dylan became more and more convinced of this last thought. He reasoned that no matter whether he shot the horse or he missed, the wolves would stay unharmed either way. And first, he needed to make sure that they would not be able to attack him after he fired his shot. He needed to find a place from which he could get a clear shot at the horse and where the wolves would not be able to reach him once they knew that he was there. He knew that this was really important. If he didn't do this, he might not return home alive. Dylan walked around for a bit, but he found nothing that he considered to be a suitable hiding place. However, he wasn't in a hurry. The horse seemed to be resting, and the wolves were also laying down around him, so it looked like they were going to stay there for a while. Suddenly, Dylan noticed a tree right next to him. It looked like he could easily climb it, and upon taking a closer look at it, it was a perfect spot to shoot from. He would have a clear view of the horse, and it was far too high for the wolves to reach him. He grabbed some branches and slowly but steadily climbed up higher. When he found a spot that felt steady enough to sit on for a while, he paused there to take a look at the animals. They still had not noticed his presence, and he knew that it was now or never. This was the spot he had to shoot from. The horse that Dylan now had in sight seemed to still have no idea about his presence, and neither did the pack of wolves around it. He was wearing special clothing that prevented the mammals from smelling him. And they were all clearly preoccupied with something else, but Dylan couldn't yet see what it was. The branches on which Dylan was leaning seemed solid enough to support his weight. He slowly took the rifle in his hands and he looked through the scope with his right eye. Just when he was about to line up his shot, he heard a strange noise. At first, he couldn't really see where the noise was coming from, but it didn't seem to stop. He looked around, but he didn't see anything moving. And that was weird, because the noise only became louder. Whatever it was, it seemed to be coming closer and closer. Before he could fully comprehend what was happening, all the branches he was leaning on started giving out below him, and Dylan went tumbling down to the ground with a lot of noise. He closed his eyes, anticipating the impact, and had accepted that this could be his end. But for once in his life, he was actually happy with the immense cold and snowfall. The thick white carpet below him broke most of his fall, and he wasn't very hurt. He would get some bruises for sure, but he immediately realized that he had not broken anything. But his relief was short-lived. He could hear the howling of the wolves coming closer. There was no doubt that they had heard him fall down, and they had probably seen him too. When he popped his head back up above the snow, he was nearly face to face with them, and they were showing him their teeth with obvious bad intentions. Dylan braced himself and waited for the attack, but that moment never came. When he opened his eyes, he saw that the wolves were, in fact, stepping away from him. They were making room for the horse, which was now approaching him. To Dylan, it felt bizarre, like the supposed pack leader was coming to decide over his fate. Would he live, or would he die? Dylan barely dared to move a muscle as the horse came closer and closer to him. He held his eyes shut tight as the animal carefully sniffed him a bit. It probably only lasted a few seconds, but to Dylan, it felt like an eternity before he finally felt the warm breath of the horse disappear again. When he opened his eyes again, the horse had turned around and was slowly walking away from him. The angry behavior of the wolves had subsided, and they followed the horse away from Dylan. But they did not seem in a rush to get out of there. Dylan struggled to get up and took a few steps backward. He was still afraid that these wild animals might have a change of heart, but there were not really any signs of this. After the horse had stopped sniffing him, they seemed to have lost all interest in him. It was also clear that they no longer saw him as a threat. They even kept their backs turned to him, with not a single member of the pack keeping an eye on him. How could these animals be so confident out here? Had they not had any bad experiences with people before? Or was it purely because of the horse? Maybe the horse had grown up around people before making its way into the forest. It could have learned to trust humans, and that might be the reason why it was trusting him too. And apparently, all the wolves followed his example. But this only strengthens Dylan's curiosity about the connection between these animals. Now, Dylan was sure that these wolves were not just protecting this horse, but there was more to it. They followed the horse and followed its lead. Even now, it looked like the horse chose the route they were going to take, and Dylan still wasn't sure about the reasons for this. He decided to follow the pack for a while and keep an eye on them. He stayed at a safe distance, just to be sure, but he did not make any effort to stay out of sight. These animals were not afraid of him, and as long as they were not surprised by him, things should be okay. It might have been a risky decision, but it was the only way that he would really get the answers he was looking for. After about an hour of walking, the horse and wolves stopped next to a particular tree. Dylan's eyes widened in disbelief as he watched something shocking unfold. He had to rub his eyes to make sure he was not imagining things. This had to be a prank, right? He was looking right at something that he had deemed to be impossible. He had seen some crazy animal behavior in his life as a hunter and as a man of the forest, but what that horse was doing now seemed from out of this world. Although this did finally explain why the wolves had been following this horse for so long without killing it. They had a kind of collaboration that seemed unheard of, yet it would certainly be an answer to all the questions that had been raised regarding this strange wolf pack. Perhaps he wasn't just imagining it. And then the real wonder started to unfold. With the wolves calmly waiting around, the horse got on his hind legs and tried to get high enough to take something out of the tree above them. Dylan had forgotten how tall a horse could be. The wolves would certainly have never been able to reach something this high themselves. But what was so special about that tree? Dylan looked up and saw an old hunting trap that had snagged up a wild boar. The poor animal had frozen to death up there. Someone in the area had obviously set this trap, but the chances of that person returning to this place were slim, considering the harsh cold. Dylan could only imagine that hundreds of such tree traps for boars exist in these woods. The houses in and around the village were widespread, and access to the supermarket was not always easy. That was why many depended on hunting wild animals for their food supply, and setting such traps has been an old tradition. The wolves had probably sniffed out these captured animals and noticed that they could be a reasonable food source in the coldest winter months. Dylan thought that the pack may very well have led the horse to these places so that it could get their meals down for them. Now that Dylan thought about it more and more, it became obvious that in return for the horse's help, the wolves let it live. Maybe they were even protecting the horse as one of their own, as it had become an important pack member. He couldn't believe that he was witnessing this special collaboration firsthand. Seeing how these very different animals coexisted and depended on each other made Dylan think twice about killing the horse. He really was not sure anymore about what he should do. Did he really need another trophy? Or was it more important for the wolves to keep their very special food provider? Deep down, Dylan knew that he needed to let them go. He waited until the horse and the wolves had gone further away, and he looked at them until they disappeared out of his sight. He had to admit that at first he was a little bit disappointed that he wouldn't bring home the trophy he had hoped for, but later he realized that he had gotten something even better. He had seen a very special and beautiful interaction between animals that usually could not live together. He realized that he would probably never see something like this again. And for the sake of the animals, he decided not to tell anybody about what he saw in the woods that day. This way, the legend of the horse and its wolf pack would live on among the locals. Dylan went home feeling satisfied, knowing that the animals were working together and this would increase their chances of surviving. He felt thankful to have seen such a beautiful thing with his own eyes.